Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 12-Point Center for Women webinar series. Today, we're talking about the invisible risks of wealth and how to protect against them. And I am Deb Cardiser. I'm a senior advisor at 12 Points, and I've spent the last 30 years helping wealthy families with these problems, helping them to identify them and then helping them to mitigate the risk. And I like to refer to these as the holes in the floor that most people don't know about and don't see coming until there's a problem. So these things are really, they're structural, they're legal, they're behavioral, and they're often invisible. And you know, when people think about financial risk, they think about market volatility, but the biggest risk that people face to wealth is they're not investment risks at all. So let's get started, and feel free to put questions in the box and we'll answer them as we go along. And I've got my contact information at the end, and feel free to contact me, send me an email. We'll be sending out this recording to the people who've registered as well. So here's all our disclosure information, which we have to provide. What fun. And talking about why this matters, you know, wealth brings opportunity. We all know about that, but it also brings visibility, and visibility brings exposure. So we want to talk about that. And the more assets people have, the more attractive they become as targets for lawsuits, for scams, for cybercrime, and complex tax scrutiny. And in addition to that, just living regular life, you're exposed to risks that we want to point out and talk about. You know, high net worth individuals are often specifically targeted because criminals see them as opportunities, but also people make mistakes just in how they bunch their assets together, how things are titled, what they're prepared for and what they're not prepared for. So the goal is not to engender any fear in this. It's simply to raise awareness and to offer some protective strategies. So the truth about risk is what makes your risk increase. Risk grows with complexity. It grows with public visibility, and it grows with fragmentation. So the fragmentation of your assets, of the advice that you're receiving, and of the professionals who are involved in helping you. So we really want to see people with multiple accounts, multiple entities, multiple properties. We want them to think about this as a holistic issue and to get help for it along those lines as well. They often assume that everything is coordinated. They've got an advisor, they've got a tax preparer, they've got people working on their situation, and they're assuming it's all coordinated, but that sometimes is not the case. So complexity is making the monitoring on all of this harder for them and more difficult for their advisors, and it creates blind spots. And that's what attackers and litigators want to exploit. So legal risks that people often overlook. So think about where you're exposed to litigation. Where can someone sue you? Where can are you putting your assets at risk? So exposure to legal risks is it's often overlooked. And one of the biggest risks is keeping assets titled in your own name. So thinking about, for example, a rental property that you have. You've got people coming in and out of there. You've got people that you don't know using your property, and it's all titled in your individual name. So now if you're exposed to any kind of legal issue, they can attach that lawsuit to your personal assets. So segregating things out of your personal name can help you just limit the exposure that you can have to litigation. Co-signing on loans. We've had issues with this. We have a grandmother who co-signed on her grandchildren's loan. The child doesn't have a great relationship with her, so the child has instructed the grandchildren not to pay her back. So now she's struggling with her own assets and taking care of her own things, and now being responsible for her grandchildren's loans. Serving on boards without protection and without knowing what kind of risk you're taking on. You're taking on corporate risk as personal risk, and we want to make sure that that's not happening. And then owning assets jointly without clear agreements is another big one, making sure that you are taking into account all these things, all these areas where somebody can attach legal risk to you. And, they often are quiet until there's a dispute involved. So awareness is critical in this case. And then how to protect yourself. Really, it's not about hiding assets. It's about structuring the ownership of what you have and doing it deliberately. And that includes having entities that hold your assets, having the correct titling. Maybe you've spent time with an attorney. We see this all the time. And people don't retitle their assets into the structures that are created. So things like trusts, insurance, how are those things owned? How is are you involved in limited liability companies? And how can you layer those assets and set them up so that you're limiting what can be attached to the liability that these assets provide to you or expose you to, and really being intentional about that. So this is consulting your advisors, consulting legal help, and getting these things set up and then funding them appropriately. Another big piece of this is having insurance. Do you have sufficient insurance? Are your assets protected with your liability insurance? So we often advise that people have liability coverage, an umbrella policy that covers all of their personal assets, or at least all of them that could be exposed from that entity. And making sure that your agreements are being signed, reviewed before you sign them. That's really important. We'll get to behavioral risks later, but very intelligent people have this idea that because they're great in one area, they're great across all areas, and they can, of course, review their own legal documents. But there's a lot to it, and there's a lot to protect you from. So get help. And then in terms of privacy risks, so privacy is one of the fastest growing threats to wealth today. Today, criminals can assemble profiles from all sorts of public records and social media, leaked data, and when they put it all together, you become a target in their crosshairs. And avoiding that is really, really important. So not only are you taking care of and scrubbing your online presence, but what other exposures do you have? Is your spouse still putting up pictures on Facebook and talking about where you are and whose birthday it is and the fact that your child just turned 18? You obviously want to limit that. We're getting pretty savvy to that as well, so that putting this all together and making sure you're taking care of things like if you've just bought a house on Zillow, you want to scrub those pictures and get them off all the real estate sites so that people can't see inside your home. Making sure that if your data is leaked, that you're doing something about it, that you have the awareness so that you have some kind of data monitoring service that's helping you, and two, that you're doing something about it. So don't just get the alert and sit there and not do anything. And over 22 billion records were exposed globally in 1 year alone, which shows you really how widespread the problem is and how prevalent data breaches have become. That's a lot of information. So privacy protection involves strategic asset ownership. If you have a high profile asset, taking it out of your individual name is really important. You can put a big home that you're acquiring into a trust so that people can't see that your name's attached to it. So making sure that those assets are safeguarded from a titling perspective. Online information control is really important, making sure that your data is safeguarded in your own home. And there's a lot of monitoring services that can help you with this. So making sure that your data isn't being shared online, but in terms of internally, you've got some safeguards in place as well. And, document storage, making sure that your tax returns aren't sitting on your computer without password protections. And ideally, they're stored somewhere else. So making sure that identity monitoring is also taking place. So making sure that you're regularly monitoring those things, and if you're not, someone else is doing it for you. So these are great ways to hire things out and get your data scrubbed and spend some short money to give you some really serious privacy protection. Another thing that people often overlook is concentration and liquidity risks. So think about somebody who's working in the tech industry. So they've got risk exposure just through their job and working in that industry. They've also got company stock and maybe some options. Maybe they've got some restricted stock units. So now we've got a pileup of not only employment risk, but you've got stock risk there as well and concentration risk. And then you've got an overweighting that your advisor's putting together because he doesn't know how much stock you have in this area that he can't manage. He can't manage your closely held stocks. So they may not be aware of that and they're not protecting against it and lowering your risks in those areas. So really looking across everything that you have, where is it? How's it titled? And now where do you have concentration risk? So often they're wealthy, but they're not flexible, and making sure that there's flexibility in your plan so that assets can be accessed when they're needed. And this involves, if you've got private investments, if you've got real estate, really making a liquidity outline so that you know what's being required when, and making sure that you've got the liquidity in your portfolio or in your savings account or wherever you're storing your money so that that can be managed and taken care of and it's ready and you're not exposed to a down market when you need that liquidity. So, people can look financially secure on paper, but they can have their wealth locked in their company stock. They can have it locked up in real estate. That's one we see really commonly, is how much people love real estate, how well they've done in the market. And so we suddenly see that they've got all of this concentration and no liquidity. So that's really important. And then, lifestyle creep happens. Are you able to access your wealth? Are you saving appropriately so that your spending isn't growing as fast as your salary increase? And are you saving appropriately to make sure that you're building those resources that you need, both for legacy, but also for flexibility? Liquidity is not about return. It's really about resilience. Do you have what you need when you need it? Is there a plan for it? And making sure that you're not a slave to your lifestyle. So ways to strengthen this, true strength here comes from balance and making sure that you're appropriately diversified. So if you're working with a financial advisor, making sure that they know everything that you hold. And if you're working with multiple advisors, pick one to be the spearhead of your financial situation so that they know everything that you have and where it is so they can make an appropriate plan for it and point out weaknesses that may be involved. And, planned exit strategies give people choices. So making sure if you've got restricted stock units, for instance, from your company, that there's a plan to exercise them, to when they come due, that there's a plan to then diversify them. So if you're getting stock awards, if you have stock options that you're exercising, this should be part of your financial plan. And maintaining your lifestyle in a way that is providing you flexibility and freedom, and not just ratcheting up, obviously, as you're going along. And the forecasting piece of things really helps to manage and prevent lifestyle creep. So talking about tax and compliance risk, as your wealth grows, your tax complexity expands and it's growing with your wealth. And you likely have more reporting requirements, more oversight, and more exposure to penalties if something's handled incorrectly. So in highly regulated environments, read your finances, your business life, you're going to have bigger triggers and bigger penalties for noncompliance. And you're also under the microscope for audits. It makes you much more of an audit target than somebody else. Another thing that we've looked at, or another thing that you should be looking at, are where do you have multi-state tax exposure? And where are you living? Is there any flexibility in where you live? And are you living in a jurisdiction that makes sense from a tax perspective? Maybe it makes sense from an emotional perspective, but looking at the tax side of things, is there something else to be considered there? And another thing that we've seen increasing lately is foreign reporting requirements. So not only foreign reporting requirements from what you own and where it's held, but also individuals with foreign tax issues. So we've seen more and more people who have spouses with green cards and they are not full US citizens yet. Well, that's a whole estate planning issue that needs to be handled, and some structures need to be set up so that you're not subject to additional estate tax, and the penalty is pretty steep. So having those assets in a qualified domestic trust is really important, and things that you need to be thinking about if you do have a foreign spouse. You are a foreigner by birth and a green card resident, so those things add exposure. And then estate tax exposure. Consider the fact that any estate tax you owe is due within 9 months of date of death. So you've got to have the liquidity for that. And they don't take rain checks, and you can't extend you can extend the filing date, but you can't extend the date on which the money is due. So making sure that there's a liquidity plan for that is really important. And permanent life insurance is a good plan for that. It can give you the liquidity that's needed to pay the estate tax, and it can keep those assets out of your estate and prevent your heirs from having to deplete their assets to cover estate tax. So just one of the ways to keep ahead of that one. And then obviously proactive planning is the most important piece of this. So making sure that you're looking at your tax liabilities, the opportunities that you have to change your tax situation. Recently, we had a client come to us who had just sold their business. And had we met with them 6 months before they sold their business, we could have saved them about $3 million. And this only has to do with titling, how things are owned, the ownership structure, and things like that. But with a few tweaks, you can save a lot of tax money. So plan in advance. Make sure that your advisors are coordinated in what the work that they're doing for you, and also what you're considering. So if you have an idea, if you're considering some options, make sure that you're coordinating your advisors and you're bringing them all in so they can offer the guidance. You're paying them. Let's make sure that they're giving you good coordinated advice. And then gifting strategies is really important. Making sure that you're gifting with stocks that have an appreciation associated with them rather than using cash, that you're pairing high income years with years that you're making donations, so those two can offset each other, and using different vehicles. Maybe instead of a family foundation, you're using a donor advised fund. And with that, you can have your donation pair with a high income year, and then you front load that with several years worth of contributions and then make the contributions over time. So there's ways that you can really use your gifting strategies that make sense from a tax perspective as well as from the philanthropic perspective. And then making sure that you're regularly reviewing what's being filed. So, for our clients, we're regularly reviewing their tax returns, culling information from there, and usually gathering additional information that we may not have known about, or accounts that we didn't know about. So having a regular filing review is really critical, and making sure that your advisors are coordinating on that for you as well. And, the whole purpose of this is anticipation rather than reaction, and making sure that these things can be handled and planned for in advance. So in terms of family and legacy risk, you've got individuals who pose risk as well as your financial structure. So think for a minute about unprepared heirs. So you want your children to be prepared for not only their financial responsibility, for being able to be fiscally responsible and make good decisions, but also to understand that what they're doing in their personal lives may be under scrutiny simply because of who their family is. Financial secrecy is another one that causes so much damage between spouses, between family members. If there are things going on under the table, it's going to expose you to risk. And understanding it and being able to communicate about it is really critical. Whoops, going back there for a second. Having clear decision authority, either in the documents that control your entity, whether it's a corporate entity, whether it's a family LLC or something along those lines. Excuse me for a second. Making sure that there's clear decision-making authority, and in your business ownership as well. That's got to be really clear and clearly spelled out. Those things should be in writing, and people should know what they are and what happens. It's also a really important thing in large families when the parents' generation is starting to fail. They're getting older, they're ill, they may not be making good financial decisions. So what do you need to put in place, and then structures you need to reinforce there, either through communication and with documents. And then having a succession plan is obviously super important in an individual level. That's your estate planning documents, and on a corporate or entity level, those are contingency plans within the documents that dictate those things. So building strength within the family finances is key, but it's more than finances. It's educating the next generation and preparing your heirs. So consider the college student who's going off to school. He's 18 years old. He's going to go off to school, have a great time, and probably get into some trouble here or there. Well, the family that's wealthy is going to have a different outcome probably than the kid who's getting into trouble next to your son and doesn't come from a wealthy family. So your son ends up in the newspaper, and or worse, and the other kid that he's with doesn't suffer any consequences because there's very low profile for them. So those things matter, and educating your kids and understanding what responsibility comes with being a part of your family and being an heir to the family. It matters. And these risks aren't really financial, they're relational, and making sure that these things are addressed are really important. Secrecy between spouses are things that we come across periodically, and it needs to be addressed. If you've got someone who's got a spending problem, a gambling problem, turning a blind eye to those kinds of things puts you at risk. So if you suspect something or you're not sure, get it out in the open and start communicating about it, because then you can address it. Documenting your wishes and intentions, super critical. This comes in through estate documents. And then there's additional things you can do, such as writing a letter to a trustee, so that in future generations, when the trust is still intact, you've written a letter talking about why you funded this trust, who you funded it for, and the things or values that are really important to you. So those are things that can go a long way to helping you. Sorry about that, getting over a cold here. And really creating a shared vision for your wealth. So this happens through family dinner conversations. It happens through talking about your values, sharing them with your kids, and getting them to talk about their values. I have a client of mine who set up a family donor advised fund, and every Thanksgiving, he has his grandchildren come to the table, even the littlest ones, and they talk about where they want to give money. And there's a conversation around it. And even the little ones can talk about things that they see in the world or problems that they know about, and can come up with what they want to address. They might need a little parental help to figure out how to direct that money, but they can talk about what they see and what they want to change. So these are conversations and ways of communicating your vision for your wealth and your family, and how to share that with your children and your grandchildren. So behavioral risks is another really big one, and one we see a lot. And I think psychology is one of the biggest risks that is invisible. And We see all the time people who are super bright, they've been very successful, and they often automatically think, well, because I'm great in my field, I'm a terrific doctor, I'm a terrific an attorney, or fill in the blank. They think that that translates to other fields. But unless you're living and breathing the financial world, you're going to miss something. So overconfidence is a big one that we see a lot. Fatigue and emotional decision making. There's as wealth gets complicated, there's lots of decisions to be made. There's lots of choices, and you can get really tired handling all this. I see it often with people who haven't handled their finances, and maybe they've lost their spouse or they've inherited money from their parent, and it's overwhelming because they haven't necessarily been prepared for it. And so those are times when we see a lot of decision fatigue. And so helping people to prioritize and do one step at a time and address these things one by one can help with that. But if you're overwhelmed, ask for help. That's really a big piece of this. And often we'll see people who aren't diversifying their investments. They've inherited Apple stock from their grandfather. It's done so well. Why would they ever get rid of it? And here it is, at a cost basis of $5 a share, and it's tanking their portfolio. So that's emotional investing, and we see different aspects of that quite a bit. And pressure from friends or family. Often it can be, you have so much wealth. Why don't you help do this? Why don't you give here? Why don't you, support my cause, invest in my company? All those things, and that can really muddy the waters, and it can be very hard to say no to. So strong financial decisions, having a decision framework, being able to put somebody off because you've got a way of making decisions and you always run it through your estate planning attorneys and your advisors, is a way to keep some of those decisions from coming at you. Integrating your team of advisors, we've talked about this, we'll talk about it some more, making sure they're communicating to each other and leveraging their expertise is really, really important. And the more communication you can have on that, the better. And having rules, trusted advisors, and time buffers is going to help you to keep from making impulsive decisions or manipulated decisions. Scammers are increasingly using voice-activated AI and different tools and techniques to get people to make emotional decisions. And I had a client who, through an obituary, the scammers got the name of her grandchildren, and they posed as a captor of one of the grandchildren, told her that they needed him to, if she wanted to see him, she'd have to send them money. Well, it wasn't overnighting money or wiring money. They asked her to put it in a box, and she went off to her bank and she put $40,000 in a box and mailed it. And the banker didn't stop her. It wasn't until she got home and one of her trusted advisors was her landscaper, and he listened to this story and said, oh my gosh, this can't happen, and stopped her and called the FBI, and they did recover the money, but it was all a play on emotions and rush decision making. So the more aware you are of that, the better. And then also making sure that you have things within your family. Devise a safe word. Make sure that your family's aware of things that could happen and ways to prevent it. So operational risks that people miss. Outdated beneficiary designations. We see that a lot. We've seen retirement accounts get distributed to ex-spouses because nobody ever went and changed the beneficiary. They weren't our clients, but that has happened more than a few times. Incorrect asset titling is another one. We talked before about getting your estate documents in order. If you don't then take the next step and title your accounts and your holdings in the name of those assets, you have expensive estate documents and an asset plan that may not be what you had your attorney write for you. So the other thing is missing creating asset lists and having missing records or having to go after somebody's died and put together these things can be crippling. One, you're grief stricken, and two, you have no idea where to look or where to find these things, particularly if you're serving as personal representative for somebody that isn't your spouse. Making sure that those people are informed and equipped is really important. And then having a plan for incapacitation. People often forget this. So what happens if something happens to you health-wise? What are you doing about that? How are you taking care of your family, your company, all those things? What plans and procedures are in place to keep things running? And what's happening financially to make sure that your income is protected? Those are things that are easy to fix and take care of if you take the time to think about it in advance. So staying organized is critical here. Annual reviews is so important, making sure that on a regular basis, your financial advisor is going over everything, that your estate documents are being looked at, making sure that you don't have somebody appointed that you no longer speak to or is no longer alive. Those things are really important. And, organization is not administrative, it's really protective. So thinking about your inventory, thinking about the documents that you're leaving for people and that you're telling them where they are and all those things is critically important. So making sure that you're putting together your files, whether or not you actually share it with someone isn't as important as having them know where to find it. So you might not want to give out your passwords and all that information now because you're still alive and you're still controlling it, but whoever's serving on your behalf should know how to access it in your absence. Make sure that that's an important part of what you're doing. And making sure that the key roles know that they're appointed and know what's expected of them. So if you've got someone who's appointed as a successor trustee to you and your spouse, they need to know that. They need to know where the document is. They need to know who to contact and who to get involved with if they have to serve in that role. So making sure that they have awareness and they have some kind of definition of what's expected from them. So there's also, and we've seen more and more of this in the news lately, but the risks of giving. This can be a problem, and making sure that your gifts are handled efficiently, that your donations and your charitable intentions have a plan. That's super important. Making sure that you've got your tax efficiency handled, you've got your reputation exposure looked at. Are you giving to an organization that could cause a problem with you professionally? Are you giving to organizations personally that you may not have done your due diligence on them? And just making sure that all of that's taken place, that there aren't sub-organizations involved, because all of this information can become public record. And so you want to think a couple of steps down the line before just giving money to charity because somebody asked you for it. And then value misalignment. Do you have a sense of what your values are and how you're supporting it in the world? It's a really easy thing to talk about with your advisor to make a plan for, and talk about it with your family. It can be a fun discussion that you are talking about and working on together. And then giving with intention, obviously the structured giving strategies are really important, whether it's a family foundation that's supporting specific causes or a donor advised fund or whatever you're doing, or simply giving to an organization where there's a matching gift from a wealthy donor on the other side. These are all really important things that can maximize what you're doing and also keep your giving aligned with your values and making sure that you're organizing your due diligence. Think of Madoff, and he was able to amass quite a following because it was sort of a word of mouth way of getting into his firm, but then everybody assumed that the person that they were getting the information from had already done the due diligence. So do your own due diligence, make sure that you're doing that research yourself and that you know what's involved. And then aligning your giving with your long-term goals. There may be causes that you want to support that maybe you're not supporting during your lifetime, but you're going to do it through your estate plan. So making sure that philanthropy is really dovetailed into your whole financial plan makes it much more intentional and gives it a bigger impact. So the big takeaway for today is that wealth protection is not reactive. It's really proactive, and it's part of the caretaking that goes along with being a steward of your family wealth. It's something that needs to happen, and these should be conversations that take place regularly within your family and among your advisors. And we also want to make sure that families avoiding major losses aren't just lucky. They've really done planning, and they have a level of preparedness that has looked at their structures, what they own, and done some planning around those things. Usually, if there's a risk, there's a way to mitigate it. So if you can think of it in advance, it's really helpful. And I think really the next steps are to really think about where you may have exposure and what we've talked about today that you've never evaluated before and you haven't talked about or managed in any way with any of your advisors. And I think the critical part here is to have those conversations and to think about where we've talked about that there might be holes in your financial floor. Again, there are holes in the floor that people fall through, not because they know they're there, but because they have no idea that that risk is out there lurking. And, the strongest financial lives aren't built on returns alone. It's really built on structure, on clarity, and protection. And when you've got the combination of those things, that's when you have financial freedom. And awareness is the first step in all of this. And action is the next step. So more happy disclosures. And I want to invite people to contact me with any questions that they have. I want to see if I can see this. Any questions that you may have or anything that we've talked about today that you'd like further clarification on. So feel free to contact us. We will be sending out your recording for this and the notes. And in addition, these things reside on our website. So if you go under the resources tab under 12 Points Wealth, you'll find this and many other webinars that are out there to help educate you, to help educate your kids. We did one just this week on financial fitness for your children, so you might want to check that out. But there are lots of things, from everything from tax to estate planning to everything in between that you can think about. So use us as your resource. If you have questions, let me know. And thank you very much for joining us today.